Let me start with a question. Let me preface what I'm going to say with a question and a statement. Who is young? Some of those people start to put your hands down, please. Who is under 35? Great. Okay, so, some people in my generation say, you're the problem. You're not the problem. You're the future. In fact, you're the solution. So it was an August summery day, and Tsutomu Yamaguchi was walking to work to collect his travel documents, which he'd forgotten the day before. And he thought he would take a shortcut through a potato field to get to work. And as he did so, he looked up, and just way up there in the distance, he thought he could see an aeroplane. And when he sort of squinted to have a look a bit closer, he thought he saw a package or something falling from the aeroplane. And 44.4 seconds later, according to the laws of physics, there was a bright magnesium flash. And a few seconds later, he was blown off his feet into a ditch. It was August 6th, 1945, and he was a couple of miles away from the hypocenter in Hiroshima. In the hypocenter of an atomic blast, the heat rises to several million degrees, and he was just outside the blast area. When he came to, he was very disoriented, but realized that he couldn't even see his hands in front of him. He was burnt down his face and his torso, his hair was singed off, both of his eardrums had ruptured, and he was completely deaf in his left ear. It might seem strange to we modern people in the modern era, but during times of war, people kept on with their purpose, they kept on with their mission. So, amazingly, he decided to continue to go to work to collect his travel documents. He got to work at Mitsubishi Industries, outside of the blast zone, collected his travel documents, and there at work it was mayhem, no one knew what was going on. This was unprecedented. So he got his travel documents and decided to go across Hiroshima to try and get back to his hometown with his travel documents by train. So he had to walk across Hiroshima, and he saw some sights that no one should see. There were 75,000 people were vaporized instantly. A similar number were severely injured or radiation affected. And as he walked across Hiroshima to get out of town, he saw young kids with their skins hanging off. He was later to say in poetry, like giant gloves. He had to walk across a small river, and the bridge had blown out, and he walked across what he was later to describe as a raft of corpses. He got to the railway station, which was operating outside of Hiroshima, and went back to his hometown. When he got there, he obviously needed medical attention, so he went to hospital. He was treated by a classmate from school who had become a doctor, who didn't recognize him at first and bandaged him up. He then went home, and his mother said famously, "You look like the ghost of yourself." It might also seem strange to we moderns with our modern life and modern conveniences, but a couple of days later, he went back to work in his hometown. He was in his boss's office recounting this tale with a couple of workmates, and no one believed this. They could see he was very badly burnt, but no one believed that there was anything like it couldn't be a bomb. No bomb was that powerful. Just then, something caught their attention, and they looked out of the window, and there was a bright magnesium flash in the sky. A few seconds later, the windows in the boss's office were blown out and they were all thrown to the ground. His hometown was Nagasaki, Japan. He's the only person in history to be twice A-bombed. I'm never sure whether Mr. Yamaguchi was the luckiest or the unluckiest person ever to have lived. He married someone who was only once radiation affected, someone who was just outside the hypocenter in Nagasaki, and they had a couple of kids. But I don't want to tell Mr. Yamaguchi's story just to capture the interest of you who might have a yearning to understand people in history or interesting stories. I want to use this to tell a story of our current world, our current environment. So my question to you is, in the current era, 2019, have we reached a turning point where we recognise what science and technology has delivered to us, but we're turning away from all the bad things that creates, such as nuclear proliferation and climate change? Or are we reaching a breaking point where we break our connection with the Earth and its benefits? Or are we reaching the beginning of a vanishing point where there will be no Earth and there will be no Homo sapiens, there will be no species, there will be no us? So that's my question. So this is Hiroshima after the devastating bomb, and it was literally flattened with one bomb. Interestingly, the bomb itself, only 1.7% of its nuclear materials fissioned. Today, we have bombs that are far more powerful and would do far more if they were ever released than Hiroshima and Nagasaki sustained. President Truman, who was the US president at the time, said some interesting things. He said, if Japan does not surrender after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there will be a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Japan surrendered 6 days later. It was going to grind it out across months or years, but it surrendered after this. President Truman also said, this is the greatest achievement of organised science in history. And that's true. The Manhattan Project, which produced the bomb, was amazing science. But the problem we would ask is, what about the consequences of that science? It cost US $2 billion in 1945. That's $29 billion in 2019. So this is serious scientific advancement, if you want to use that word. And this is what it's produced. Nuclear warheads now that are so powerful, we could kill all the people in the earth many, many times. So George A. Cowan, who was a physical chemist who worked on the Manhattan Project, said, I have had second thoughts all my life about this. But he also said, without nuclear weapons, we might have been on a more ruinous road to destruction. There's two schools of thought. There's a school of thought that said, without Nagasaki and Hiroshima, we would have had more casualties, more lives, more destruction. The other school of thought is we should never release bombs on people. I've been to the Peace Park in Hiroshima. It should be on your bucket list if you have not been there. It shows how many people were killed in Hiroshima and also Nagasaki. 75,000 instantly in Hiroshima, 40,000 in Nagasaki, and many, many, many more injured and maimed and radiation affected. Mostly kids, mostly civilians. Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't theatres of war, they were cities with people living in them. The troops weren't there, they were other places. The most evocative thing in the Peace Park is is the steps of a bank. And this is a person, this is what's left of a person, who was waiting on that fine August day in Hiroshima to go into the bank. They were standing on the steps of the bank. And they were vaporised. And that stain there is what's left of them, etched into the steps of the bank. I'm not prone to emotion. I get a few highs now and again. I'm not prone to emotion, but I cried for a long time at this site. This person's organic atoms mingled with inorganic stone. This is my hero. This is Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Mr. Yamaguchi, you might be surprised, I'm certainly surprised, lived until he was 93 years old and died of stomach cancer. He had a family, and after the war, he was so generous-spirited, he acted as an interpreter for the occupying American forces during the post-war years, and later he became a peace activist and wrote poetry. But the story doesn't end with Mr. Yamaguchi and his life. In the 1940s, 50s and 60s, humans tested, the nuclear countries tested many, many bombs much more powerful than Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And when they did so, they released plutonium-239 around the world. So etched in the rocks and in the soil and at the bottom of the oceans are plutonium-239. That's an element, an isotope of an element. And it has a half-life of 24,000 years. So it will be there for a long time as a marker of nuclear proliferation, the nuclear age. And geologists are very interested when markers go down etched on rocks, because that signifies the changing of an era from one time to another. So geologists are the people who name eras. You know, there's the Jurassic Park, and the Devonian and the Cambrian. And the current era is called the Holocene. The current era is called the Holocene. And the geologists have decided to rename the current era. Do you know the name that they're renaming the Holocene, the current era, the name for the current era, to? Do you know what the new name is? I'll come back to you. So are we at a turning point in the Earth's history? Will we change this? Will we fix this? Are we at a breaking point? Or are we at a vanishing point? So geologists have decided that the data shows us that we are in a great acceleration since Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the science that was produced there. A great acceleration. And the geologists have decided that we're not in the Holocene, but the Anthropocene, the age of humans, the age of man. And one species, us, is changing the whole character of the world. And that's never happened before, that one species has so dominated the world. So they've decided this is to be renamed from the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, to the Anthropocene. It's the only time a creature has renamed the current era that they live in, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of cool if you're a scientist. So these are some data. It doesn't matter if you can't see the detail. These are data about world population and GDP and fertilizer consumption and energy use and water use and paper production and transportation and international tourism, etc. What do you notice about the data? The technical term is it's a hockey stick. That is to say, it goes like that. And the question about hockey stick data is, where does it end? Where does it go to when you extrapolate it? And where does it end? So here's world population from 1300 to now. Here's fossil fuel consumption from 1800 to now. Here's temperature, world temperature. It's okay, rest easy, we're only in the blue bit so far. The red bit is the projection. If it gets to that temperature, Earth will be like Venus. So, if we all consume at the current rates of the average Australian or American, we'll need not one Earth, but two Earths, not two Earths, not three Earths, but 3.5 Earths. And hey, we only have one Earth. So that's a problem. So my question is this, or one of my questions is this. Are we smart enough to create technological advances since the Manhattan Project and to purpose design the world in which we live and enjoy the benefits, which we do, but not smart enough to solve the problems that have been created as a result of that ingenuity? And just to choose the two I'm talking about, nuclear proliferation and climate change. Let me put this another way to you. Can we survive our own cleverness? Are we in fact going to create a world where the technological is married to the biological features of the planet and live in harmony? Or are we going to have a breaking point and then a vanishing point? Each of us has a role to play, and I think the next decade, the decade of the 2020s, is the most pivotal decade in human history. What are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? What are the under 35s in the audience going to do about it? Because we're relying on you. Thank you very much.